When you look at the latest public opinion polls, you see the Liberal Party currently has the support of about 40% of the people who have made a political choice. The New Democrats have support in the mid-20s, while the governing Conservatives and the Reform Party both have support levels in the mid-teens. For a Tory party that has been in power since 1984, such a low level of support doesn't bode well for its re-election chances when it goes to the polls sometime next year. So, more than a year before the election is likely to be called, the Conservatives have begun a radio advertising campaign. Not to sing their own praises, but to criticize the Reform Party. Now, the Reform Party is getting most of its support in the Conservative stronghold of Western Canada. But that's not where the first anti-reform radio ads have been run. They've been run in Ontario. Well, joining me in Toronto to explain the reasoning for all of this is John Tory, co-chairman of the Conservatives' re-election campaign. Hello, Mr. Tory. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Don.
Let me ask you this and help me with the arithmetic. I understand there is strategic voting, but on the other hand, when you look at the public opinion polls, we see the Liberals at around 40%, the NDP in the mid-20s, and the Conservatives and the Reform Party in the low teens. And then we hear the Conservative Party is running ads against the Reform Party. Why don't you run the ads against people who are way ahead of you in the public opinion polls instead of people who are sharing about the same rung with you?
At the moment, the Reform Party, I think, is bleeding some support from us. There's no question about that. And we think that we have to make sure people understand that in many cases, if they vote Reform, what they're going to do is to assist in the election of a Liberal NDP government. And we think that when people think about that and think about the kinds of spending and taxation policies they get from the Liberals and the NDP, that they won't want to vote Reform for that reason and among others.
So this is all to do with strategic voting at the moment, to try and protect your base rather than to convince people who are going to vote Liberal now.
But partly, but I think as well, Don, we think it's important that people kind of know the truth, if I can put it that way, about the Reform. I think this is a party that has policies that are far more extreme than people understand. I think it is a party that is pretending to be one thing when in fact it is quite different. You know, they pretend to be a grassroots movement when in fact it's a sort of a one-man show run by Mr. Manning all by himself with no team, and so on. And I think that we think it's very important that people understand that, and I think we've had some success. If you look at the Reform, while they're still a factor, and we don't take them for granted by any means, they have certainly stopped growing. I mean, they have, in fact, the party that's growing this month, although it's no cause for an immediate celebration yet, is the Progressive Conservative Party. So, you know, we're taking all the parties very seriously. For now, we're trying to get a handle on the Reform because they're new and because they add a sort of a different factor to the politics of Canada.
Well, I confess I haven't heard the ads, Mr. Tory, but from what I've read about them, essentially what they're saying is, and you say the Reform Party has extreme positions, but essentially the ads are saying, wait a minute, if you want a party that does that, the Conservatives are already doing it. If you think their positions are extreme, and that's what your ads are saying, you're in effect saying your own policies are extreme. I wouldn't think you'd want to say that.
It's a matter of degree. I mean, we have restrained spending. I think the last budget showed Canadians we've restrained spending quite significantly. We've reduced taxes. The Reform Party, on the other hand, says they're going to restrain spending by cutting 10 to 15% off the top. What we've said in these ads is, look, they've got to explain how they're going to cut 10 to 15% without doing away with aid to farmers, chopping off senior citizens' pensions, badly affecting the health care system. I mean, we've reminded voters that the Reform Party says they're going to do away with universal Medicare. They're going to put the GST on groceries. And these are things we're certainly not doing. We're trying to restrain spending, but doing it in as humane and sensitive a way as we can, whereas the Reform Party would take a meat cleaver to the services that Canadians have come to enjoy, and we're just not prepared to accept that.
When the polls show that the Reform is most popular in Alberta and then in British Columbia, why are you running the ads now in Ontario, particularly around Orillia?
Well, because the local riding association in Orillia, where the Reform has actually been quite active, not as active as in some parts of Alberta, the local riding association came to us and said they were interested in doing this, and we said, well, fine, we'll work together on this. So we just started off. But there's other activities being initiated by other associations and cities in other parts of the country, and I guess that will all be revealed in due course. But that's just where we happened to start off because somebody came to us with a good idea.
Well, let's talk for a moment about strategic voting. Essentially, if you could recover the vote that's gone to the Reform Party in Western Canada, and a bit maybe in Ontario, and the vote that's gone to the Bloc Québécois in Quebec, you could get re-elected. You don't have to worry really about people who are going to vote Liberal and NDP. Is that fair to say?
Well, yes, I mean, elections are never quite that simple. I wish it was that simple, but, you know, Mr. Bouchard has said that the Bloc Québécois will disband and won't fight the next election if the Constitution is resolved, as I think every thinking Canadian hopes it will be, so that they may not be a factor at the time of the next election. And I think we're very hopeful that when people figure out what the reform is really all about, they won't want to support them, you know, because they'll understand that there's quite a difference between what they thought they were voting for and what the reform actually is. But I guess more so than any of that, Don, we really are looking forward to running a campaign that's positive and that says, look, we have a plan for the future. We have made the tough decisions that sure were unpopular at the time, that were needed to get the economy rebuilt and to get the Constitution sorted out. So I hope we'll be able to run a campaign that's very positive in nature and that really talks about our own accomplishments and our own plan for the future as opposed to talking about the other people.
Going beyond the advertising, are you ready to run that campaign as early as this fall if the Prime Minister suddenly decided that on your advice, I'm sure, that was the strategic moment?
Well, we'll be ready whenever we have to be ready.
So you're essentially ready now. Is that
well,
fair
we're
to say?
getting there. No, I wouldn't go so far as to say that, but we're getting there. We're making good, solid progress, and he has said repeatedly in public terms the election will be in 1993, which is still what we're expecting. But whenever he tells us he wants to call the election, we'll be ready for him.
Just very briefly, by spending money on the advertising now, if the writ doesn't come for an election until 1993, you've got a long time where you can spend money without putting it against your election expenses. Is that right?
Well, but, you know, what we're really trying to do as much as anything else is just try a few new things, and the reform is new. I mean, it wasn't really there as a major factor or as important a factor in the last election, and we're just trying to sort of get a handle on them and learn how to deal with them. It's all part of campaigning, and it's not a matter of trying to cut down on election expenses. By the time the election comes, if it is indeed next year, people will have long since forgotten about these ads that you're interested in today.
Mr. Tory, thanks for your time. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Don. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. John Tory, the co-chairman of the Conservative re-election campaign. Well, what does the Reform Party of Canada think about all this newfound attention? Stephen Harper is the Reform Party's Director of Research, and he joins us now from Calgary. Hello, Mr. Harper. Nice to see you.
Hello.
Let me ask you this. Is it a case of good news, bad news? Reform Party is going to get its name on the radio and all of these new commercials, but it's going to get its name on in a disparaging way.
Well, you know, I guess we'll see what we're going to be hit with. I think overall it's good news. They wouldn't be attacking us unless we were pretty important in their eyes. And I think the source of the attacks has so little credibility that it may well backfire and may well help us.
In what sense would it help you? If they say you have a secret agenda, for instance, and that you're going to cut spending 15% off the top and it's going to hurt all sorts of constituencies that might otherwise vote for you, how could that in any way be positive?
Well, I think one of the things that may be positive about it is the source of the attack, which is the Conservative government, which doesn't have a lot of credibility when it makes these kinds of statements. You know, I think on, just take that issue, the issue of deficit reduction. We've said that we're going to attack the deficit if elected through a series of spending reductions, not the simple across-the-board cuts they talk about. We're not going to increase taxes. Now, the question is, how is the Conservatives, who are the government, how are they going to deal with our deficit problem? You know, they put out estimates showing the deficit dropping to zero magically in 4 years. That's not a policy. So I think when people, you know, people aren't as stupid as these ad geniuses always think. I mean, they're going to ask questions about the people who are putting on the ads as well as the questions that we expect them to ask us.
Well, if the ads do have some effect, would the Reform Party consider matching the Tories ad for ad? Would you mount a campaign of your own, perhaps?
Well, we may well have to mount an ad campaign or use other vehicles of getting our message out. You know, it's no secret that we don't have the money the progressive Conservatives do. We don't have access to the corporate money. We don't have access to the government money that has been used in, you know, for instance, some previous mailings and brochures done by MPs. So it might be hard to match it ad for ad, but we have a much better on-the-ground organization to get the word out on our position on some of these things.
Well, when you point out, though, that you don't have the money, is this really going to be a problem, particularly as the ads start now? Mr. Tory was saying he wasn't doing it to avoid campaign spending limits, but the fact is, if the ads start now and the election doesn't come until later in 1993, there's an opportunity for a lot of advertising that doesn't come under the Election Expenses Act, and maybe by the time the election comes, you're going to be in trouble.
Well, we can afford some advertising, and hopefully in the course of the next year we'll be able to afford more. Our fundraising efforts continue to improve. But, you know, we would like to do some pre-read advertising because as you know, there is a special ban through an act of Parliament on the Reform Party's advertising during the election campaign. We're not granted the same airtime as the Conservative Party or the other parties.
And that's because you don't have members in the House, though, right? I mean, it's not aimed directly at you. It's aimed at parties that don't have members in the House.
We're the only party that it affects. You know, we're the only party that's going to be effectively limited by the time limits that are applied to us. And I think the law does exist to restrict the growth of new parties.
Let me ask you this. One of the attacks that is going to be contained in these ads is that while you put yourself forward as a grassroots party, that really it's a creature of Mr. Manning. Outside of Mr. Manning, there aren't really many identifiable Reform personalities in the country. He essentially was the founder of the party. Isn't it true that without Mr. Manning there wouldn't be much of a Reform party?
Well, it's obvious that Mr. Manning is critical to the party. He's the leader, and the leader of any new political party is ultimately the thing that makes or breaks it. But, you know, I don't think we'll have people with high profile until we have an election and have a chance to elect people. But in the meantime, we do have 120,000 members. We do try and involve them in many aspects of the party, and including in getting our message out. And that really is where our strength is, particularly in a city like Calgary, where we have literally, you know, 10,000 plus members. The Conservatives are trying to fight us with, you know, with a lot of money, but on the ground with numbers of people that are in the order of the dozens. And they're going to have a tough time getting their message out on the street where it really counts.
I guess the other criticism that they're going to include in the ads, and just if you can answer this briefly, Mr. Manning's father was the Social Credit Premier of Alberta, and a lot of people, particularly in Eastern Canada, are saying Reform Party is just social credit with a new label.
Well, you know, I'm one of the leading policy people in the party, and I was never associated or even voted for the Social Credit Party. So, and most of our members don't, you know, many of our members don't even remember the Social Credit Party. So I think that's a bit of a reach. I guess, you know, it's like saying the Conservatives are the party of John A. Macdonald. So what? You know, I think people are concerned about more substantive issues.
Mr. Harper, thanks for your time. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Stephen Harper in Calgary.